Okay,
Take over where we left off yesterday.
so good morning, everybody. Did anybody have any questions from yesterday? I did have an addendum. Somebody asked, and I can't remember who it was, about the RB Digital data, if you were in the RB Digital Consortium.
That was me.
Okay, and I did hear back from Matt Kovar actually yesterday afternoon, and he said that before they switched to Overdrive, they actually pulled some reports from RB Digital, and so he is going to be getting me that data probably within the next 2 weeks, and then I'll go ahead and pre-fill it on your survey just like we did last year.
Nice. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yep. Yeah, it was kind of coincidental because I got an email from him yesterday afternoon, and they were able to, I think, pull those reports because otherwise I think they might have went away. So it's good. Does anybody have any questions about what we talked about yesterday on the finance part, library collections or anything? Maybe something that you thought about after the fact? You can either type in the chat or unmute yourself. No? All right, great. I'm going to turn on the show last year's answers like we talked about yesterday so we can look at kind of on this test survey. As we head into library services, number of registered borrowers, one thing that I want to point out with this that a lot of people might not know is that in the definition, we'll pull that up here. IMLS does recommend that you purge your borrower records every 3 years. So that may be something to consider. I don't know how often you purge those, but they do recommend every 3 years going through those records and maybe purging people that are no longer around or have moved. Annual library visits. Some people have door counters. Some people do this based upon an estimate. We can click on the question mark and it'll pull up how to count that as a typical week if you do it for an estimate. Again, if you notice here, the total number of persons entering the library for whatever purpose during the year. One follow-up question that we have to that this year is 5.3. IMLS wants to know if this number that you enter here is an actual count or an estimate. And there's just a pull down menu here that you can enter. Yeah, I have a door counter. I counted everybody that came in, or I counted them via hash marks, or I estimated that based upon an average or typical week. They added that for a number of questions, that estimate or actual count. Same thing with reference transactions here. They've added that question as a follow-up in 5.5. Is it an actual count or is it an estimate? And reference transactions, we do get some questions about what to count and what not to count. You can click on the question mark and it's going to pull up this great big huge definition here you can read through. The key point I think here is that you would count as a reference transaction information consultations where library staff would recommend, interpret, evaluate, or use information resources to help others. Kind of some examples that I give are, say that Tammy was my local librarian and I came in and I was looking for books or resources for a particular report that I was writing for school, and I asked her for recommendations for resources to look at. That would count as a reference transaction. Or if I needed help using a computer or another resource in the library and asked the librarian for help, that would also count as a reference transaction. Things that we don't count as reference transactions would be what we would call directional transactions. Examples of those would be if I came in and said, how late's the library open? Where's the restroom? That type of thing. You don't count those. Those are directional transactions. Now keep in mind that for reference transactions, you count consultations that are done in person, over the telephone, via email, via chat, via text message. The platform is not necessarily important. It's more of the nature of the question that's being asked. And it's quite possible that during a transaction, you may have, I may come in and ask for resources on penguins because that's what I'm writing my report on. And then during the course of that consultation, I might ask some more questions of the librarian about how to use a database, for instance. That might count as more than one reference transaction. It might count as two. Or if I had another question, you would count that as maybe 2 or 3 transactions, depending on the nature of the conversation. And that's kind of difficult to count. There is a little bit of a judgment call there as far as counting reference transactions. Sometimes it can be difficult. And again, if you keep track of those based upon an actual count, like hash marks, just enter actual count here. If you estimate that based upon an average week, just enter an estimate for that. And that's the new question that IMLS wanted to know. Yeah.
What about reference or questions where they're coming in? I've heard this different ways and say, okay, find me a good book.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that count as a reference? I'm assuming it's a reference.
If someone came in and they said, find me a good book, and during the course of that conversation, you would ask them, well, what kind of genre of books do you like? And they say, well, I usually read James Patterson mysteries. And then you said, well, if you like James Patterson, then here's some more authors that you might like, and made a recommendation. I would count that as a reference transaction.
Okay.
Now, if they came in and said, where's the mystery section? And you said, well, it's over there. I wouldn't count that as a reference transaction. But yeah, I think in the example that you gave, I would probably count that as reference transactions because you're making a recommendation to them for a particular resource or a particular book or a particular genre of books. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
I think reader advisory is probably going to be a lot higher this year with curbside service. A lot of librarians are just picking out the books for the patrons.
Yeah.
So they'll probably be higher.
Yeah, it may be. And some libraries do bundles of books based upon a genre. They'll pull, a bundle of 5 or 10 books and put them in a bag, and then somebody will come and pick them up. Yeah, it could be. Then we head into circulation. So 5.7 is circulation of adult materials that excludes downloadables. So you would exclude from this count overdrive materials. This would be adult materials like in your collection books, CDs, DVDs. And we realize that sometimes there's a judgment call with what would fit into the category of adult and what would fit into the category of children's. There are some things that maybe cross over into adult and children's. So that's kind of a judgment call based upon maybe how you have those cataloged in your collection. I always tell people, if you don't know from your catalog reports if it qualifies as adult or children's, to just include it with the adult circulation. We'll get it in the total. We have for total circulation, it adds both of them together. And then 5.8 is your number of circulation of adult downloadable materials. This would be like overdrive. And note here that this is pre-filled with your overdrive circulations if you're in the overdrive consortium. If you have another vendor, you'll have to add to that number. So for those of you that have RB Digital, when we get that data, I will add that to your overdrive number here, and that will be the total for RB Digital and overdrive. And I'll probably send an email out to everybody in that consortium to let them know that I've added that to it. And then we have total circulation of adult materials. And then same thing here with children's. We have children's circulation excluding downloadables, and then children's downloadables, which is pre-filled with the overdrive number. And then we have a bunch of totals here. We have Bibliostat do the math for us. And these are all purple questions. So they're federally required, IMLS federally required questions. Total circulation of total circulation of children's materials. For some reason, they don't want to know the adult. They want the total children's and then they want the total. So if you want to know the adult, you have to do some subtraction there. Total physical item circulation, and then use of electronic materials, and then total circulation of library materials here. And those will all be pre-filled based upon, what you entered above. It'll do the math for you. So then we head into databases, or what IMLS calls electronic collections. We include databases in parentheses here because that's, I think, a term that most people are more familiar with. And what they call, what they use in the definition is they call it electronic collections. They don't use the term database, but I think more people are familiar with databases. So if you have any of those, you just enter the number here. And if you don't have any, just enter a 0. But if you have local databases, like say you subscribe to Mango Languages, and say you had one of the RB Digital products, maybe what used to be Zinio. And kind of the thing here is that what you report in this section are electronic collections that don't have a circulation period. So when we looked at that flow chart, that massive flow chart yesterday about how to count electronic things, these are things that are permanently retained by the patron, or things like Mango Languages or lynda.com, things like that don't have a circulation, or are permanently retained. I think the Zinio magazines are reported here because they're permanently retained and they're not technically returned. So if you had, say, 2 or 3 of those, you would enter the total number of databases here. And then a lot of you, if you remember from last year, we used to have you itemize all those and the number of uses for each one. Note here in the red note, we don't require you to itemize everything anymore. What we found was that we really didn't have any requests for specific uses. We just wanted to know the total. So here, in this example, we had Mango Languages. And then say we also had lynda.com. We just separate those with a comma now. So you would enter the name of them and then just separate by that by a comma instead of entering each one of them as a repeating group. And I think that's important for large libraries like Omaha that has a lot of databases, or Lincoln that has a lot of databases, or some of the others, Grand Island. And then we just want to know the total number of uses for all these. So you would pull from your reports the number of uses for Mango Language and lynda.com, combine them together, and then just enter the total here. And I know from some of the vendor reports, sometimes those numbers are kind of tricky with trying to determine what report because of the model that they use. So if you have questions, let me know, and I've looked at some of those reports and kind of help people to decide what number to report. Sometimes that's kind of difficult. And then 5.19, we have, this is pre-filled with 25. This is the number of databases that are funded by the Library Commission. This would be Nebraska Access. And then 5.20 is the total local, and then the 25 for Nebraska Access. So that would be 27 in this example.
Sam,
And then IMLS, I'm sorry?
there's a question for 5.17. Would
Okay.
Chilton from Gale go in that
Yep.
field?
Yep, absolutely. That's a common one. So if you had Chilton's manual, you would enter that here just by a comma,
Thank you.
So then that number would change to 3. That would be another one that would be, yeah, fairly common for an electronic collection or a database. Okay. So then we have a couple of totals here. IMLS has a federal element called electronic content use. What this is this is just the sum of your overdrive circulations and then the sum uses of your databases. They report that as what they call electronic content use. And then total collection use, which is the total of all of that. all the circulation, and then your databases. And we have a couple more federal questions about interlibrary loans. Total library materials that you loan to other libraries, you would enter that number here. Let's say it's a 10. And then total materials borrowed from another library. Say you borrowed 25. And kind of the common question that we get here is that for 5.24, if you borrow a book club kit from the Library Commission or the systems, you include that in this number here. And so, for instance, if you had a book club kit that had 10 books in the kit, that counts as 10 interlibrary loans. So you don't count, even though it's the same title, it's 10 different items. So you would add that to this number here, it would count as 10 interlibrary loans.
Sam, we do have another question. I think about the temporary free database that was available during the shutdown. Is that included?
Which database was that? That wasn't the summer reading one, was it? Or was it something different?
I don't know, Jenny, what one was that? I think they've had trial ones available during the shutdown.
Yeah, and I think if we pull this definition here, I think there is a requirement, and let me pull it up here. I think there's a requirement that there has to be a monetary exchange, and you don't report things that are free.
Humble Books and Book Cloud. But if they were temporary free, they would not be included then.
Right, and I think it's not in this definition, but I think if we pull the federal definition, I think there's language in there about monetary exchange being a requirement, so that would exclude the free databases. So I don't think you would report that.
Thank you.
Was that Jenny and Skylar? If you want, I can email you the definition, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's the case, that if it was free, you don't report it at all. So that should be kind of a relief, because then you won't have to pull those numbers. Number of Nebraska card registrations during the year, that's if most of you, if you participate in the program, that's a reciprocal lending program that's offered through the commission. If you've issued any cards, you put that number there. Otherwise, that'd be a 0. And then we head into programs. And I will say that after reviewing some of the surveys that have been submitted this year, what I'm seeing so far, and we'll see if the trend holds, is that for quite a few of the libraries, and we haven't received that many surveys, I think we're maybe up to about 10. What I'm seeing is circulation numbers that are relatively consistent with or close to what was entered the prior year. But for programs and computer uses and things like that, I'm seeing numbers that are way low. And that's what we would expect based upon, closures and limited hours and curbside services and things like that. So we kind of had this longish definition of what to count as a children's program. Some things to note here. You count all children's programs, whether they're held on or off site. So if you did, a common question is sometimes libraries offer programs at child care centers or off-site or locations other than the library. You still count those as a children's program if it's sponsored by the library. If another outside group comes in and uses the library meeting room for their own program, you don't count that as a children's program because it's not sponsored by the library. If it's co-sponsored by the library and that outside group, you'd count that as a program. And then a lot of the time we want to know, well, what qualifies as a children's program? The definition here is the target audience for the program persons age 11 years and under. That's what they define as a child. And so kind of some of the common questions that we get here. you would just put the number of programs offered here. And one of the common questions about what to count is that we see is like summer reading programs. If it's a summer reading program, but it's offered as a series, so it's I'll say 12 weeks in the series, you count that as 12 programs, even though, you know, it's the same summer reading program that's offered every week. It still counts. So if you look, I think it says that in the definition about programs that are offered in a series, you count as each time it's offered in the series, you count that as one program. And then you count the average attendance at the children's programs, and then there's the total here. Now, one of the common questions that we get about children's program or attendance at programs is, even though this program may be targeted towards children, you count everybody that attended the program, regardless of age. So in other words, if you had a children's program where there were 10 preschool kids and 10 or 12 parents, and maybe an older sibling that came with them and sat in on the program, you count everybody that was there, regardless of age. And that's kind of a common thing, that sometimes people undercount this number because they don't count everybody that's there. We'll probably get this question about how to count virtual programs, because I think libraries are maybe offered those. They shifted maybe some of their summer reading or their other programs to Zoom, for instance. If it was a live program where you had attendees, you still count that as a program. If it was a recorded program that you offered someone to view on your website, that wouldn't count or fit into the definition of a program here. Counting attendance at those types of things may be more difficult because you may not know how many people are there. There may be people sitting off camera that you can't count. So we realize that it may be difficult. Sometimes libraries have gotten around that by having registration forms indicating the number of people that are attending the virtual program. That's one way to count those. I know I don't use Facebook, but I have had a question from a library that used Facebook Live. And I think there's from what I understand, there's a report that can be run from Facebook Live that gives you a number of peak live views, which seems to be a pretty good number to count. Because in those types of programs, people may start the program and then they may drop out midway through. People may join late. So it's hard to count, you know, the number of people that attended a virtual program. And I think that's going to get even more difficult as more programs are offered that way on different platforms. And then we want to know about early literacy programs for children. And keep in mind, this question here is a subset of these questions up here. So
Yeah.
even though you may have, you know, in this example, 100 children's programs with 10 attendees. So we want to know, out of that 100 programs, were any of those focused on early literacy or pre-K? And if that's a yes, then we want to know the total number and then the average attendance there. So this number here can't be larger than the one that you entered for the total children's programs if you had targeted pre-K programs. And if it's a no, then we just enter no here.
Okay, there was a question about what about packets that were handed out in person instead of in-person program?
Okay, so like a program activity that was maybe bundled or so, like summer reading kit that was handed out.
Right.
Yeah, I would still count that as a program. You know, because it's something, it's not like a passive program where a library just puts out some coloring sheets. It's something specifically targeted to replace a in-person event. And so if you handed out like 12 kits, I would count that as 12 attendees for the program. Yeah, I would count that.
Okay.
That's a good question.
And then Amy from North Bend asks, even if we can't count the number attended a recorded Facebook children's program, can we count the program?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, if you don't know that, and you don't have a very good estimate of the number of attendees, I would say try and estimate it if you can. If you don't, just count the program and then don't count the number of attendees if it's really hard to determine.
Okay,
But
and
you
then,
would still count the program if it was a live program.
thank you. And then Peggy from Randolph says, how would you count a family program? Example, a magician, we would have 50 children, 25 young adult, and 25 adults. That'd be
Right,
100 people, right?
right. So that brings up an interesting point. All state data coordinators, so every state has a data coordinator. I'm the one for Nebraska. Every other state has one, including US territories. So we also have data coordinators that are in American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the Mariana Islands. We all meet usually in person, but obviously not this year in person, in December, to discuss new proposals for survey questions. And at our conference last year, that whole issue was raised. And I think we are going to see a proposal in the next few weeks to add a new category for programs for all ages, or virtual or family programs, or maybe even intergenerational programs. I'm not sure how the definition would actually work, because that's a common thing. Where do I put that? And so I think I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a new question, maybe even next year, that has another category for all ages programs or family programs. But for now, I would say it's kind of a judgment call on your end. Like in the magician example, you know, what's your targeted audience? You know, and I realized that it may be, you know, we want all ages or families to come, but it's kind of a judgment call on your end to include that as children's or young adult or adult. I would probably include it as children's, but it kind of depends on the nature of the program itself. I would say just the important thing is you don't double count it. If you put it into children's, don't also count it as an adult. But I think that's a common thing. And that's why we'll probably see a new question about, or a new, you know, category for all ages programs or intergenerational programs. So after the early literacy program attendance, then we have the same thing as children's, just young adult. And that's defined as 12 through 18 years. You would enter again the number of programs, the average attendance, and then Bibliostat does the math again for us. And then adult programs, the number of adult programs, adult program attendance, and then the total. And then Bibliostat will calculate the total number of library programs and the total attendance at those programs here.
Sam asked for a clarification on Facebook story time. So if there's a Facebook story time, but it is not done live, is it not counted?
Right. So if you, there is a new COVID question that we'll get to. I think it's on the next page, that asks about recorded programs. But in an example where a librarian would record a program and then make it available to other people after the fact, you don't count that in this category up here with the programs that were the page that we were just on. You would count the pre-recorded. I think there's a yes or no question that was added this year about recorded programs. And we'll get to that probably on the next page. So then we want to know about summer reading programs for, you know, did you have a summer reading program for children? That's just a simple yes or no. And then how many children participated in the program? I think last year we actually asked for a breakdown of registrations and then completions, and that didn't really fit with what a lot of libraries were doing, as kids, young adults, or adults come in and out of the program. We just kind of want to know how many participated in the program. And this is a state question, so we realize this number may not be exact, depending on the model that you have for your summer reading programs. We also want to know for young adults and adults about those summer reading programs here. And then we head into the COVID related questions that IMLS added this year. So the first one is, did library staff continue to provide services during any portion of the period when the library building was physically closed to the public? That's a simple yes or no. If we click on the question mark, it gives us more examples about services that were offered. You know, did you, while you were closed, answer the phone, email or text message? Did you host virtual programs? Did you offer curbside or delivery services? Did you offer Wi-Fi or manage your IT networks or provide other services? I think for most people, this is probably going to be a yes, because you offered some services. There are a few libraries that were closed completely, but most offered some sort of modified services. And then they also want to know, did you add or increase access to electronic collection materials due to the pandemic? You would enter a yes in this if you say you cut back on your purchases of physical items, and then maybe reallocated part of your budget to purchase more electronic items. Or say you were not a member of the Overdrive Libraries group, but then you decided that you wanted to join to increase the number of electronic materials available, you would enter a yes here. If nothing really changed, then this is just going to be a no. If you continued your purchases as they were normally made. And then they also want to know, before the pandemic, did you allow for online registration for library cards? If you did that before COVID, you would enter a yes. If you didn't offer that service, you would enter a no here. And then they want to know, you know, did you do that during the pandemic? You know, like say if people didn't have a library card and they wanted one, did you maybe complete a registration online? Or this also counts for, we've had a question about, what if you did it via the telephone? You would also enter a yes here if it was done over the phone or via email. And then, did you provide reference services via the internet or telephone when the building was closed? You would include email, text, and chat. That's, again, yes or no. Did you provide for outside service for circulation of physical materials when you were closed? Again, yes or no. Common question here is drive-through service counts. I know a couple libraries or a few libraries have a drive-through. You would count that here. And if you click on the question mark, you include vestibule, porch pickups, delivery, drive-through, etc. I think that covers most of those questions. So if you offered those curbside services, you would enter a yes. And then here's the question that we had before. Did the library provide live virtual programs via the internet? If you offered Facebook Live as a program, that would be yes. If you didn't, enter a no. And then the question that we had before about recordings of programs. Did the library create and provide recordings of program content? Again, that's a yes or no. And I would say for libraries that did offer those and want to report the number of views, you can always enter that in the federal note. Like if you have that data and want to report it, you know, we provided a recording of, 25 programs and the number of views was, 1,200 or whatever it was. You can add that in the note. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future this gets added as another question about programs, about live and virtual programs, virtual and recorded programs, and then the number of attendees. I think that may be difficult to determine the number of attendees as we discussed earlier, but I wouldn't be surprised if IMLS added that as a national question. And then, yes.
We have a question in chat from Kathy. What about putting craft videos on our Facebook page? Does that qualify as anything?
Yeah, I would count that. I would count that here as recorded program content here. And then 5.55, before the pandemic, did your library provide Wi-Fi outside the building? That's again a yes or no. And then during, did you provide Wi-Fi during the pandemic or times that you were closed at yes or no?
Now, Sam, a question on that. I know there are a couple libraries that got access points to amplify. Would that be something you would put in the notes here, maybe?
Well, actually, that's covered under 5.57 here.
Thank you.
Did the library increase access to Wi-Fi internet use at one or more outlets? So if you added some of that equipment so that users would have better access in the parking lot, for instance, you would enter a yes here. Yeah. And then the last question is, they want to know, in some libraries, staff were reassigned during the time that the library was closed. So they want to know if you worked for a different governmental agency or nonprofit instead of or in addition to your normal duties. What this would mean is if you were reassigned, like say the city decided that the library would be closed for a month, but then they reassigned you to filling potholes or something, who knows. I think that happened in some places where city staff was reassigned to other duties. You would enter a yes for that if you were, or no. I think most people probably still worked in the library and provided alternate services like curbside pickups or virtual services. And then we head into the technology part. So those are the COVID related questions that IMLS decided to add this year. And like I said yesterday, I anticipate that those will probably remain on the survey for next year. We might see some slight variations on those, but I would anticipate most of those same questions being asked as we head into, a lot of these measures and libraries are, still occurring. We want to know the name of your automation software. In this case, looks like last year we entered Biblionics. You can highlight this and then just do a Control-C and a Control-V if that didn't change. And then we want to know if you provide public internet access. That's, yes or no. And then the number of internet computers used by the public. And I think the important point here is like, say you had a dedicated computer lab with 10 desktop computers, but you also had 5 Chromebooks that maybe the public could check out for in-house use. You would enter a 15 in that example here because you also count laptop computers, tablet computers, if they're available in the library for in-house use. So you would count all those or include in this number. And I think that's probably more and more the case as libraries are maybe trying to spread people out in the library that are using computers. We're seeing more Chromebooks instead of desktops or laptops where people can maybe distance themselves instead of being right next to each other in the computer lab.
Would you recommend in the notes to define what each one is or not necessary?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part.
Would you recommend putting in the notes, say 10 laptops?
Yeah, you could put that in the note. Sure, you could say, I'd love to be able to look at that data and say we have 10 in our computer lab and then we have 5 that we circulate, 5 Chromebooks, for instance, that we circulate for in-house use.
And then Kathy from Lee asked if a Kindle would count as a computer.
Yes, I would count that. Yeah, that would fall under the tablet computer definition. And yes, I would count that.
Thank you.
If it's internet connected, and I think most of them are. The only thing that you would exclude from this is I think some There are some AWE workstations maybe for kids that aren't internet connected. And you wouldn't include that here because they're not connected to the internet. But if it's a tablet computer that's connected to the internet, yeah, you would include it under 6.3. And then we want to know the name of your filtering software. So this would be, here in the note, we've differentiated this from antivirus or anti-spyware programs. This would be as if your library has a filter, like if you're E-rate eligible, you have to have a filter to filter or block certain websites in accordance with the Children's Internet Protection Act. A common one would be Net Nanny. I think some libraries have that as a filtering software. We just want to know the name of the software that you use, if you have one, or if you don't. If all your internet computers are unfiltered, you just enter an NA or a none. And then we want to know your ISP. Looks like last year on this test survey, it was Windstream. Let's say we switched to Spectrum. We would enter a Spectrum there if we switched, or Allo, whatever your ISP is. Or say you were still with Windstream, you would enter that there. And then we want to know the type of your internet connection. We have a pull down menu here that I noticed when we were doing the training with Central Plains. Some of these probably can be edited because dial-up is one of the options. And I hope nobody's on dial-up these days. We have some of the more common ones: DSL cable, fiber optic. There's a few that are still on satellite in rural areas. You would just enter the type of connection here. If it didn't fit into any of these categories, you just enter other here and then enter more information in the state note, since this is a state question. And then we want to know if your library provides Wi-Fi. So that's a yes or no here. And then we have a national question that always causes us fits. IMLS wants to know on a national level the number of if you offer Wi-Fi, the number of wireless internet sessions logins provided annually. And I know that for most people, this is a difficult number to ascertain because we have people in the parking lot that use our Wi-Fi. We have people in the back of the library that may or may not be using their phone to access the internet. I know when I go into local library here in Lincoln, because of the fact that I use their Wi-Fi with my phone one time, it automatically connects every time I go in, regardless of whether or not I'm actually using it in the library. So that for most people, this is going to be a difficult number. I would say if you can, check with your IT department, if you have one, or maybe your ISP, like in the example above, Windstream. There may be instructions where you can get a representative sample, like in an average week, from your router, where you can then multiply that by the number of weeks that you're open, kind of for a decent estimate for this number. But I know it's difficult. It's hard to catch people that are outside, that are around the library building. I don't think that this number is super accurate. We're probably undercounting it more than overcounting it. Some libraries, if they're smaller, they kind of keep a hash mark. If they see somebody come in, or they kind of keep an eye on what's going on outside, and they know kind of how many people might use their Wi-Fi in a particular day or particular average week, and then they can kind of estimate it based upon that. But for most people, it's going to be hard to ascertain this exact number. And then we want to know the download speed of your main internet connection. And we ask for a range here. And again, this number could vary quite a bit from when you do the speed test. You might check with your ISP and find out what you're paying for, and then do a speed test and kind of look at that. I know I had some speed issues here on my home connection. I'm supposed to be getting 50 megabits per second, but I'm actually getting more like 20 most of the time. So it also depends on how you do the speed test, if it's over Wi-Fi or if it's a wired connection. Or in your library, if you did the speed test in the morning when there's nobody or relatively few people in the library, you might get a different answer from maybe if you did it in the afternoon where you had a lot of kids in the library playing video games or connected to the Wi-Fi. So that's kind of why we have a range here of, the average download speed of your main connection.
Sam, can you recommend us a site for doing a speed test?
Yeah, so, and I probably should put a link to that up here. That would be kind of helpful to have a link like in the question mark. That's one thing that maybe I could look at. We recommend, or the state recommends a site called Network Data Tools. So that's N as in Nancy, DT, speed test. But I know that others have used speedtest.net, or sometimes ISPs have their own speed test that you can use too. But the one that we've recommended, I think our tech people here at the commission and through the state have recommended that NDT speed test. And that may be a good tool if you did a speed test and found out that you were actually paying for 100 megabit service and you were only getting maybe 10. That may be time to contact your ISP. Maybe your equipment's outdated. Maybe you need to look at your router or the type of connection that you have. And I would say that if you're a librarian and you have questions about that, Holly Wolt at the Library Commission kind of works with libraries about their network equipment, and maybe can do some troubleshooting or some assistance for you over the phone or via Zoom too. So you could contact her at the commission. We want to know, does your library have a makerspace? And you might ask, well, how do you define a makerspace? We've tried to provide a relatively short but detailed description here. So makerspace is a place where people can work independently or collaboratively to make things. And then some common things like there may be a focus on electronics, robotics, woodworking, sewing, laser cutting, 3D printing, programming, or other things. I would say the other things are commonly like craft things. I know that there's some quilt groups that meet in the libraries. I would probably count that as a makerspace because they're working collaboratively to make things. And then we want to know if your library has one, is it a permanently allocated space or is it a temporary or shared space? The temporary, we have some libraries that maybe they have a 3D printer in the closet, but they roll that out on Thursday mornings for to the meeting room for maker time. We would count that as a temporary space because it's kind of a dual purpose use. But if it's a dedicated space in the library where that 3D printer remains all the time, then it's a permanently allocated space.
So something like this, it would be beneficial for you to put notes in the state level of what you have?
So we actually have some categories here in the next part where we want to know, kind of what equipment you do have. And then we separated that by the virtual visits because it was kind of confusing with all the pull down menus. So we just kind of put the makerspace part and then the virtual visits to separate the two. And then we ask about what you have in for technology in your space. So for virtual visits, again, this is a national question. It's often difficult to ascertain. The good news is that if your library is hosted by us through the Library Commission, we pre-fill that number for you. So in this example, if your library is hosted through, I think if you're one of the 100 and some odd libraries that have your website through the commission, we'll pre-fill that number for you. So in this case, you had 11,555 visits to your website. If your website's not hosted by us, a lot of the time you can check with your host and maybe find out how many times your website was visited. if you don't know, sometimes websites are maybe hosted by the city and they don't have access to those reports, or they don't have an accurate number. You can just enter a 0. We'll go back in later and then change that. There's a code that we enter when we submit to IMLS that indicates that the data was not collected or not available. And so if you enter a 0, I'll go back in later and change that to the code when we submit it to them. And then, so this is the question, Tammy, that you were asking. We want to know, does your library make available these technologies? And these, again, are yes or no's. These are kind of the common ones that we would see in a Makerspace, I think. 3D printers, scanners, laser cutters, vinyl, CNC routers, sewing, embroidery machines, laptops, tablet computers. So even though we included those in the public access computers, we also want to know here, do you offer those to your patrons? Early technologies, those AWE stations that we mentioned, digital production labs, gaming consoles, robotics, electronics. And our technology librarian has tried to provide some examples here. Augmented or virtual reality, we added this year because I think a lot of libraries have added those. Oculus Rifts and other things, or Oculus, what do they call them? No, Oculus Rift is the, that's the superhero, right? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, Oculus, if you offered those, that'd be a yes. Code camp services, video game design development, 3D modeling software. Again, if you don't know what these are, a lot of them I don't know what they are, you just enter a no. And then anything else, you can just enter it here if you offered it. Like we mentioned, quilting supplies, materials, whatever. Just enter that in the other part. And then if you entered a yes up here, I didn't go through all of them for the test survey, but then if you entered a yes up there, then down here, there'll be a follow-up question that asks if you provide training on those topics. And so like if you had a 3D printer, we want to know, did you provide formal training or programs for use of the 3D printer, or informal or one-on-one training, or no training at all? So you would enter those for all these technologies. And like I said, if you entered a no up here, like let's enter a no for 3D modeling, it should disappear from down here, I think. Yeah, so it disappeared from the end. So if you enter no for all of them, you won't even see those questions. And then our technology librarian also wanted us to ask these questions in 6.14, and I think we were able to condense this. I know in past years this was a long series of yes or no's. We've tried to condense it because by the time you get to this part of the survey, you might be experiencing some fatigue. Do you offer digital literacy training or assistance on the following topics? And again, this is formal, informal, or no. So online security, if you offered training or help to people that came in the library, you would enter a informal here. If you offered formal programs, you would enter formal, or no if you didn't offer anything at all. Online communication, buying things online, online etiquette, digital law, health and wellness, or privacy. And we added this question last year about E-rates. We were kind of trying to collect more data about why people didn't participate in E-rate. So we were kind of looking for feedback on that. We left it on this year. I anticipate that this might go away next year as we've kind of collected some of this data. But for now, we've left this on the survey. If you have applied for E-rate in the past, yes, no, or I don't know. And then if you have never applied for E-rate, we want to know kind of, why you haven't done that. Like you used to do it maybe, and now the process is really overly burdensome, or you don't know much about it and would like more information, or the discount wasn't large enough to justify the time involved, kind of, why you didn't apply for it. And if you don't know what E-rate is, kind of enter that in the note and we can put you in touch with somebody that might. I think Krista is now working on E-rate training, starts, is it today or this week? So Krista Porter is the E-rate coordinator, so you can contact her if you want more information about E-rate. Basically, it offers a discount on your internet services. That's category 1 E-rate, and category 2 E-rate is kind of the infrastructure. So if you were looking at, maybe increasing the Wi-Fi in your library, or some of your equipment or your internal connections, you can apply for E-rate and maybe get a discount, or some of that paid for through the E-rate process. Okay, so that is it for library technology, and the final section is staffing. So in the staffing part, I would say that some people are kind of confused by this. In 7.1, the way we had our survey designed was we used to have you calculate the FTEs. So if you had a person that worked 40 hours a week, that would equate to 1 full-time equivalent. So 40 times 40 divided by 40 hours a week would be 1. And then we got smart and said, well, why are we doing that when we can have Bibliostat do our math for us? So that's the way that the survey is set up now. So in 7.1, you would enter the total number of paid librarian people. So if you had 3 librarians, you would enter 3 for the number of people. And let's say all 3 of those people were full-time. They worked 40 hours a week. If that's the case, then you would enter 120 here for the total number of hours. If you had 2 full-time people that worked 40 hours a week and 1 that worked 20, you would enter 100 here. So 40 plus 40 plus 20. We sometimes get questions about what to categorize as a librarian, because there is another section where you count other staff. There is a definition here that kind of defines a librarian. I always tell people, if you have somebody that works, that that maybe their title is library technician, but they work the reference desk, or they work the circulation desk, I would count them as a librarian. That's someone that I would consider as a librarian. If they're a cleaning person, or an accountant, or work in a business office, I would count that under the other staff part. If they're a shelver, sometimes shelvers answer reference questions. So if it's somebody like that, I would probably count them as a librarian. Maybe they're a backup for the circulation desk. I would count them as a librarian. If they just come in and shelve books and refer all of their questions to the main desk, I would probably count them as other staff. And then here you'll notice Bibliostat calculates the FTEs for us. So it takes the number of hours divided by 40 here, and that calculates that as 2.5 FTEs. So if you had 40 here, that should calculate as 1 FTE. And again, when you enter this number, just click in an open space and it should do the calculations for you. You would need to hit save if it was in a repeating group to see it. And then in 7.4, there's a national question about paid ALA, American Library Association, MLS librarians. So this is actually a subset of what you entered in 7.1 through 7.3. So what they're asking is, out of these 3 people that we entered up here, do any of them have a MLS degree from an ALA accredited institution? So in this case, let's say we had one person that had an MLS degree and they worked 10 hours a week. So then that calculates that you have 0.25 of an FTE for ALA MLS librarian. And then here's the non-librarian paid staff here. Let's say we had an accountant and a cleaning person. We would enter that there. And then let's say the total number of hours that they worked was 30. Say the accountant worked 15 and the cleaning person worked also 15. That calculates to 0.75 FTEs for other paid staff. And then it calculates the total FTEs down here. That would be the 1 FTE up on the top and 7.3 right here. And then the accountant and the cleaning person would be the other 0.75. So the total paid FTEs is 1.75. And then we want to know the title for the library director. Most of the time this is going to be director or library director. And then the hourly wage for the library director. You would enter that here. We sometimes get requests from libraries that want to look at salaries that are similar in size. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we collect that data. And then we want to know the number of volunteers. And again, this is in many cases going to be kind of an estimate, because I've had libraries say, well, in the summertime, we have a lot of volunteers for summer reading. Maybe that was the case last year. But during the winter months, we don't have as many volunteers. So this is kind of going to be the estimate for the hours. Here in 7.13, you count the total number of people. So say you had 20 in the summer and 10 during the winter, you would count 30 people. And again, maybe sometimes they come and go, so that's difficult to ascertain the exact number. This is a state question, so I wouldn't get too worried about it if it's not completely exact. And then an estimate of the total volunteer hours per week. So if on the average you had 10 total hours for volunteers that they worked, you would just enter a 10 there.
Sam, there was a question about other library staff.
Okay.
So our city clerk does all the library books. Would that count as the same as accountant in that category?
Is the city clerk paid by the library or are they paid by the city? That would be the question. So if the library, if they're paid by the city and they just help out, and you don't report, if the salaries weren't reported on this survey in the finance part, I wouldn't report them as paid staff here. If they are paid from a portion of the library funds, then yeah, I would report them as other paid staff in this part here. But my guess is maybe that's in addition to their regular duties and their pay, the money doesn't pass through the library. So I wouldn't probably include them here. That would be the key question.
Okay, that answered that, I think. Thank you.
I think so, yeah. So then we have the narrative section. And again, this is optional. A lot of libraries, if they have an annual report, we do want to know, what your library is doing in the community. In the definition here, it says, please describe major successes and challenges. We do look at these narratives. If you had something, a lot of libraries, if they have an annual report, maybe they have a narrative section from that, just copy and paste it into here. Or if there's other feedback that you want to give us, this is the opportunity to do that. Or if you don't want to enter anything, it's not required, a required question, you can just leave it blank. And then here we want to know, the final section is the certification section. So we want to know the director or authorized individual that filled out the survey. In this case, we want to know in a larger library, like if another staff person filled out the survey and wasn't the library director, we want to know who to contact if we have questions for follow-up. So in this case, if you had an assistant library director, you would enter their name here. Like say that was Joe Walsh. Say he was assistant library director, and you would put their title here. Or in most cases, this is going to be just the library director. That's who we would contact if we had questions for follow-up. And then the date that you submit the survey here. So today's date is the 17th. You just enter that there. And then there's a description here about how to submit the survey. So on this page, you would hit save first. And then we talked about edit checks yesterday. So once you've completed the survey, you can go ahead and try and submit it here if you want. But my guess is that you're probably going to have some edit checks and unanswered questions, especially on this one, since we left a lot of stuff blank. So I always tell people, go over here to show status. Then you can look at the status of your survey. And you'll see 3 buttons up here at the top. There's one for your edit checks. And again, kind of what edit checks are is the Bibliostat system looks at the data that you entered this year and compares it to data that was entered last year. And if it's outside of a certain range, it'll throw up an edit check and say, hey, wait a minute. You know, you've had a large increase or a large decrease from what you entered last year. Or it looks at other questions and says, you know, hey, this number can't be larger than another number over here. Or other things, and it wants to know maybe why the data was outside of a certain range. So you'll need to look at these edit checks and enter a note. And if you notice here, like there's one that came up under the first one for population of legal service area. Looks like last year that was 1,300 and this year it was 4,548. And it'll tell you here on the edit check that that's a large change from last year, and it's asking for you to, you know, to verify if that's actually the correct number. And so here we've entered a note that says we now serve the county, and so that explains the population change from 1,300 to 4,548. And you'll notice here that this this text over here is now in green. Whereas this text down here that does not have a note is still in red. So for everything that appears in red, you'll need to enter a note here in the federal section because these are purple questions and they're federally required. And I'd anticipate some of you may see, you know, if your data is outside of a certain range, a lot of these notes are going to be, you know, we were closed 10 weeks due to COVID. You know, you could enter that as a note. And then once you enter a note and save it, then this text will go from red to green here. And that'll satisfy that edit check. You can either enter it here or you can enter it in the survey itself. I find that, you know, it's better to wait until the end because maybe sometimes I think IMLS has maybe increased the ranges for some of those questions, like programs, for instance, this year, because they know that everybody's programs are going to be low. So whereas you might have gotten an edit check last year, you might not get it this year because they've changed the range. And then you'll notice here, you'll also see flagged questions. So we talked about flagged questions yesterday. If you flagged a question, it would show up here and say, hey, you flagged a question. You won't be able to submit the survey if you have a flagged question. And then there's a button here for unanswered questions. And then a couple of options. You can view the required ones or every unanswered question. So the required ones are ones that are probably going to be in purple. These are ones that you'll need to fill in. You can just fill in the data without going back to the survey. And then at the bottom, there should be a save button. We probably have a lot of them here. Yeah, at the bottom here, there's a save button. You can just save that there. So once you have all those edit checks that turn green and you have your required unanswered questions, you can go ahead and click on this submit button here. And you'll see here, if you tried to do that before, it says you don't have any flagged questions, but we have some required questions here. See the red stop sign or caution sign or whatever it is. And then we also have edit checks here to deal with. So once we've entered notes and answered all those questions, all 3 of these will be green check marks. And then once that occurs, there's a second button that'll appear down here at the bottom of this screen that will say Submit Survey. So the submission is kind of a two-part process. You need to first submit, click on Submit here, and then click on that second Submit button. And once you do that, there should be a little pop-up that appears that says, congratulations, your survey's been submitted. And then your survey will be locked, so you can't enter, go back and make any changes. Once you submit your survey, I get an email automatically from the system that will indicate that you've submitted your survey. And then kind of the process there is I go back in and I'll look over your entire survey. And if there's questions that I have, maybe that will come up later that I know that maybe IMLS will ask us, I will send you an email and ask for some clarification so that we can maybe get notes entered that need to be entered, or maybe some things weren't entered correctly. I know that just in the surveys that I've looked at this year, we've had some cleanup that needs to be done with the hours open because the COVID hours, the closed due to COVID hours are not included in that, what is it, 2.22 and 2.23 questions. So I'll email you if I have questions. I can make changes to your survey. I usually ask you, hey, is it okay if we changed it to this? I won't make changes on my own without contacting you first for your approval. If there's things that you do need to change, I can unlock your survey and you can go back in and make changes later on. Again, you can also print here. You can log back in at any time. Back to the survey list, you can print surveys that you submitted or for prior years. Again, we also keep a local copy. So I can send a PDF to you if you want, just email me. Does anybody have any questions about the survey? I'd like to show you a little bit about the final data that we publish and where that's at, but if there's any questions about the survey, we can go back in and look at that. No? Well, that's good news, huh? So kind of the process here is, like I said, our data collection goes until mid-November. We usually have a lot of surveys that are submitted at the last minute, so the last week. So it takes me some time to review all those. There's usually, mid to late March is kind of when we're cleaning those up. Once we get them cleaned up, we get our data files from Bibliostat, which is, like every library's survey and kind of this Excel file. And we submit that to IMLS. Our deadline, I think, is around June 1st. We like to have our data cleaned up by then because we usually try and publish it late spring. Our deadline used to be the accreditation process. We'd have to have it done and everything loaded into the accreditation application. I think that would normally open, I think, June 1st or July 1st. I'm not sure. So we'd like to have it done before that. Once we get it all cleaned up, we publish it on our website, and you could get to it from these flyout menus over here. But I find the easiest way to get to that page is to just type in data services. And that takes us to the main data services page here. And you'll see a few things here. We published our fiscal year 2019 survey data. There's a link to it there. You'll see links to the survey, Bibliostat, the supplemental survey, which we'll go over in a minute, state aid, and then here's our historical data. So you'll look at here. If you click on this main page here, it'll take you to all of the statistical data that we have. It looks like last year we were a little late. We published it on June 9th. I'm betting that was probably due to the COVID shutdowns and closures. So you can download this great big huge Excel file that contains everybody's data. If you're looking for a data set, maybe you're one of those libraries that wants to look at, libraries that are comparable to yours, say within what we would consider your peer libraries on the accreditation application. You can always email me and I'll pull that data for you. Like if you're looking at libraries that are maybe within 15% of your legal service area, which I think is usually what we use on the accreditation application, and maybe you want to look at, what the public funding was from the city or the local government revenue, and then maybe you want to look at circulation. You can always email me and I'll just pull that data set for you. Or we also have the accreditation files that are more detailed, that have the actual data from those libraries that are used. You can email me and I'll send those to you. But if you want to look at the great big huge file, you can always download it here in an Excel file or a CSV. We mentioned about the supplemental survey, and I wanted to show you that real quick. Let me back up. So once your survey is finalized, you'll get another email from me saying, great, everything's taken care of, you're all done. Here's a link to the supplemental survey. This supplemental survey you can do at any time, but we usually like to send a recommendation or a reminder after the public library survey to have you look at this. And so the ID and the password are going to be exactly the same as the other one. You just log in here. And then it should look like this when you log in. Your library name will be up here. If for some reason this data changes throughout the year, you can always log in at any time and change it. Like if you had a staff turnover, or your board data changed, or your hours changed, you can log in at any time and check this, but we like to have you at least review it once a year after you submit your the public library survey. And so you just go in here and enter the staff data. There should be a thing that comes up. If John was the library director, you would check that and then check to make sure that their information is still accurate. And then I think at the bottom, there's a save button. So yeah, you would submit it here. One thing to keep in mind is that, so this information feeds into our website. So if you looked at a profile for, let's say, Ralston, keep picking on Francine. I saw her yesterday on this call. So here, that information feeds into here. You'll notice here, Francine is the acting director. We have her as the contact person. We also have some facts from the survey. So this is from last year's survey here. The source is last year's public library survey. We know that Bayright's operating budget was a little over $500,000. We pull this data from the survey. The other stuff is pulled from the supplemental survey, like for hours and things. Keep in mind that when you submit the supplemental survey, there's a 24-hour approval time period. So when you do the supplemental survey, it goes to our IT guy, Vern. And once he approves it, then it'll be updated on the website. So you may not see, if you log back into that, you may not see the changes right away. So check back in a day or two. And if you don't see the changes made after that, you can email him or email me and we'll check on it and find out what's going on with that and make sure that it's accurate. Okay. Does anybody have any follow-up questions or anything?
One thing people should be aware of is the statistics is a required part of accreditation.
Right. The public library survey is required as a part of accreditation, and also the supplemental survey. So at least once a year. So you'll see reminders come from either me or Krista if you haven't submitted it. So yeah, if you want to keep your accreditation, which also means you keep your state aid, you want to make sure that you submit your statistics. And I think that will still probably be a requirement, even if the accreditation process is suspended. I know it was suspended or delayed this year. So if that occurs next year as well, you will still need to submit your statistics to maintain your accreditation. One thing to keep in mind, if your library is not accredited, if you submit your statistics online via Bibliostat, you are eligible for a $200 for what we call dollars for data grant from the commission. And then you will be eligible to apply for accreditation, because that's the first step. If you've submitted your statistics, then we have all that data and we can compare you to other libraries and see where you're at. And then you would do the other things that are required for accreditation. And that, in most cases, that's going to be a an increase in the amount of aid that you get from us from that $200 that would be initially. So you would be eligible for more state aid from us. And state aid is usually paid in the spring. We use the data, so when we pay, when we do state aid calculations next spring, we'll use the data that you submitted last year, because we're a year behind. Because when we are working on the state aid formulas and getting those paid, we're still cleaning up the surveys that we're collecting. So for next year, we'll use the fiscal year 2019 data for state aid, because we'll still be collecting and cleaning fiscal year 2020 data. I have had a couple people report errors with Bibliostat. I think we've narrowed those down to mostly browser issues. I had one yesterday, and we kind of came to the conclusion that she was using Edge, which doesn't play nice with Bibliostat. She switched to Chrome, and everything, seemed to be much smoother. So like I said, Chrome and Firefox, I think, are the recommended browsers. You might have some issues with Edge or IE if you're still using those. Any other questions? Well, if you do have questions when you get into your survey, I'm here to help you. You can always email me. You can call. I'm working remotely most of the time, but I do have voicemail to email. So if you leave a voicemail, it comes to my email, and I'll usually call you back that same day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Sam.
you.
Appreciated it.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you,
welcome.
Sam. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes.
Thank you.